Welcome everyone to another edition of the New Jersey Cannabis Training Academy live Q&A. Again, my name is Precious Osagie-Aresa, and I have the pleasure of being your level 1 instructor as well as your instructor manager for the CTA. As always, we want you to get comfortable in the chat. Feel free to introduce who you are, where you're calling in from, and what you're pursuing in the cannabis industry if you're open. It's an opportunity to also drop any small wins you have. We always want to celebrate you and continue to big you up, especially as you're going through the cannabis industry. If this is your first time, welcome. If not, bear with us as we go through our opening housekeeping. We know that this could be one of the most challenging processes you'll go through applying for an adult use cannabis license, so get ready. There are several people on this call at various stages of the application, but if you follow the training and really stay in your lane, figure out what you want to achieve, and be okay with where you are, you'll get closer to submitting that application and starting your cannabis businesses. Us here at CTA are committed to helping you get to that application finish line, which is why we felt important to host these Q&As, which support the supplemental material and the portal material that you guys are going through. So here's how this will work in a moment. We have James Jackson here, and I'm super excited from. This has actually been one of my very first friends in the cannabis industry years ago. I'll allow James to introduce himself and talk a little bit about his course. After that, we'll go through some of the pre-prepared questions and pre-submitted questions that you guys gave in. Again, feel free to drop any questions you may have while we're having this conversation in the chat or in the Q&A box. We'll go in order. And if you are going to drop questions, feel free to keep them concise and on the topic at hand. We know we talk about so much when it comes to the cannabis industry here on our Q&As. This is level 6. We're talking about your plan to obtain liability insurance specifically. So if you have any other questions outside of this topic, feel free to drop them. We might be able to get to them, but we're definitely going to talk a little bit about insurance. If you've missed anything, you can go back to the portal and watch our levels 2 through 5 and 6A. Those videos are now up, so you can catch up on any of those items in case you have missed it. We do expect that if you are on this Q&A, you have at least gotten through this course. Again, this is level 6. And if you're new and you have questions regarding the portal and how to navigate the modules, you can also ask that here towards the end. We'll get to some of those answers. So without any further ado, because I truly usually am excited for all of these conversations, but because I'm also talking to a friend and a fellow rock star in cannabis, James, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our students.
Absolutely. I appreciate it, Precious. Thank you for the amazing words. And yes, Precious, one of my first friends in the cannabis industry here in New Jersey, both, Howard University graduates. We had to say that before we got off of here. But yeah, a little bit about me. So, I have a certification in horticulture and cultivation. A little bit about my background. For some time, I was the senior director of social equity at Parallel, one of the larger privately held cannabis companies in the country. I also have been in the insurance space for a little bit over a decade, in the cannabis specific insurance space for about 9 years, helping create the cannabis practices at some of the larger global insurers in the global market. And actually now VP of Cannabis Risk and Benefits over at Risk Strategies. We are the 8th largest privately held broker in the global market. We are a specialty broker, and I concentrate specifically on helping cannabis businesses all over the country, in all of our medicinal and recreational states, protect their businesses by way of risk management. A little bit more about me. I'm also an entrepreneur in the cannabis space. I am the CEO and founder of Europe. We are a micro cultivation company, as well as just received our approval here in West Orange for manufacturing as well. So we will be adding that also. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm just excited to be here and be working with you all and be give my level of expertise as it relates to insurance, because this is a very important portion of your business, to make sure that your business is protected adequately and is here to stay around by way of that protection. So I'm happy to be here this evening.
Nice. Thank you so much for that, James. Let's jump into it because when you think of cannabis, you can only really think about risk. So insurance seems like should be top of mind to folks, but I feel like sometimes it gets sort of like bowed, sort of like bugged down behind everything. When you think about all the plans you need to submit to the CRC, insurance are just kind of like, oh, let me remember about insurance just from your experience. And I want to kind of like, if there are any stories you can give, how important does insurance play for a cannabis business? And why is it so important for folks to make sure that they're obtaining insurance for their cannabis business?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, listen, insurance is not insurance is it's an old business, right? It's definitely not the sexiest thing to talk about in cannabis. It's insurance is vital to all businesses, right? Not just businesses, also people's personal lives, right? It is the thing that makes sure you have coverage just in case, right? And in many situations, specifically in the cannabis industry, it's vitally important. Just because this is a more risk adverse industry, right? Not to mention a lot of our businesses, specifically here in New Jersey, this is what I want to concentrate on. These are startup businesses, right? These are a lot of small businesses. And for small businesses, startup businesses, a loss could unfortunately mean, mean the doors closing shortly after they open, right? And I don't think people realize it from that perspective, but a large, six-figure loss to somebody's P&L is not necessarily that something that you can just come back from, right? So it's vitally important to make sure that, like any business, but specifically a cannabis business is, protecting their space, their building is also protecting, just for retail, for cultivation, for any business on in the cannabis industry, you're protecting those that enter your property, right? And if you have a product and or you're selling a product, making sure you're protecting that product and anything that may come from that product by way of loss. Insurance is vitally important. Also understanding that, those that come from the legacy market and conversations that I've had to have for years, is our mind state in the cannabis industry has kind of always been, hey, I'll self-insure. I'll put some money aside for a rainy day just in case. I'll put a couple 100,000 aside in case I have a loss, in case I have a product liability claim. But because things, the industry is where it is now, the insurance industry has also evolved. It's made coverage, less with less exclusions. It's made things a bit more affordable than they have been in the past. And frankly, insurance is much more affordable and a better option than possibly self-insuring, depending on the size of your operation. But making sure that you have coverage in place, right? The same way as in New Jersey, you get behind a wheel, you don't get behind a wheel without auto insurance, right? Like as a cannabis business, you should not be in production, start production, be forward facing with consumers as a retail business without that level of protection.
Yeah. And talk to me a little bit about the different types of insurance, especially as it pertains to the supply chain in cannabis, from cultivation, manufacturing, retail, delivery, and even those that are on the product brand side, which I'm also on. Like, how does insurance vary for those businesses if you were looking at cultivation versus if you're looking at retail, or is it just like a one size fits all solution in insurance?
Yeah, so not a one size fits all, right? So I would say, and also depending on where you're at in the process is kind of how you need to insure things, right? So if you're an early applicant and right now you just have a building locked down, I mean, at that point in time, there's no activity, you need a vacant building policy, or you just need a building policy to cover that structure itself, depending on what your lease is, right? So there's a lot of different nuances with insurance. And it's funny, I get on calls with people all the time and they're like, hey, can you tell me like a roundabout what this costs? And I'm like, I would love to, but there's so many different things that play into that, right? And one of those things is what line of business you're in the supply chain, right? So like from a general liability standpoint, every business needs general liability, right? Like that just protects you from a standpoint of just bodily injury, property damage. The most common loss in general liability across all businesses is slip and falls, right? So somebody coming in a dispensary, slipping, falling, them having some type of medical action because of that, having to pay for medical bills, and people suing organizations. That's just very common across the insurance landscape in general. So everybody needs general liability. Then you think about right property. From a property standpoint, everybody for the most part, well, everybody in New Jersey has to have a physical building that they're working out of. Well, I'm sorry, with the exception of those that are on the branding side, you don't necessarily have to have a physical building because you're working with those that do have a physical building. But if you're retail, you have a retail storefront. If you're cultivation or manufacturing, you have a facility in which you need to protect. Depending on your lease, whether it's a triple net, whether you are purchasing or own that property, would depend how you chose to insure that property, meaning actual physical property insurance for the whole structure itself. And then there's a portion of property insurance that focuses on tenant betterment improvement, right? So as a retailer, your build out, right? What you put into that building. As a cultivator, what you put into your outfit of your cultivation facility outside of the structure itself, but covering what's inside of those walls, right? And then as part of that property coverage, there's also coverage for business personal property. So that's anything from your computers to your kiosks to your furniture to all of your equipment in any line of business that you're in. A big difference in property for cultivators and manufacturers versus retailers is, cultivators actually have the ability to have crop insurance, right? To actually cover their crop from clone to, clone to harvest, right? And then have the ability to cover that product in transit. Manufacturers, same thing. They have the ability to cover that product as either, as the distillate has come to them or they're toll processing the distillate themselves. They have the ability to cover that product while it's in their walls as well as in transit. Um, uh, from a retail perspective, retailers are mostly covering finished product at that time, right? They're covering the product that they have at their dispensary at any one given time. And that's covered for things like theft, employee dishonesty, things of that nature that could arise from a loss from a retailer. So those are some of quick differences. And then just from like a product liability standpoint, I think it's important everybody in the cannabis industry has product liability. I think a lot of retailers think because I don't create a product, I'm not, responsible, but they are normally the first person named in a product liability suit because the consumer actually interacted with them and got said product, received said product from that business, right? But as a manufacturer and a cultivator, product liability is vital as well because you're actually creating that finished product. And if someone were to say, hey, I had an adverse reaction, it caused me to go in psychosis, you need that coverage to protect you against those type of lawsuits that could arise.
Yes, and that's a very interesting breakdown because even as I'm processing and remembering, like we have had issues in the cannabis industry, especially here in New Jersey, where there was some product that was not good. And folks found out later on and had things in it, it got recalled and all those situations. So people really had to understand and start to protect themselves from, the possibility of that happen. And please believe lawsuits fly in cannabis industry probably quicker than most others. So I want to jump into a little bit more about the different coverages, but first I'm going to talk about the application process and how folks can obtain insurance for their application. What's that process like? Where do they even start when they say, hey, I actually do need insurance? Who do they contact? So let's talk about the conditional side because we know have obtaining or proof of insurance or proof that you will have insurance coverage is required for that conditional application. If someone is just waking up ready to fill out that application, how do they start to obtain that proof of support from an insurance company for that
Yeah,
for the conditional
yeah, absolutely. So I would say, just I would say find a broker, right? Find a broker like myself. So, when I say, there's just to take a step back, to take a step forward, there are a few different parts of the insurance industry, right? We'll just highlight two of them, right? Myself, I'm a broker, so I actually represent clients, right, to the other side, which are the carriers that actually hold the policies, right, and issue them. So my job is to tell the best story and represent the client, my clients, to get them the best coverage for the best premium, right? By way of telling that story, the carrier, obviously based on the risk, based on their appetite for risk, based on the full picture of what that client's full risk picture is, they come up with a quote, right? But before we even get to that on the application side of things, the conditional application side of things, you really just have to have a plan that proves that upon receiving full approval, you have the ability to obtain liability insurance, right? I think the unique thing about me is I'm also a successful applicant, so I know what it takes to go into that part. But um, it should go deeper, or at least for me and for successful applications I've seen have gone deeper than just talking about liability insurance, but talking about all the different insurances. And normally that's something that you can get by working with someone like me. I've issued many letters for applicants so that they're able to get past this portion. It's basically a letter that breaks down the different coverages as well as the coverage amounts that the applicant will be able to secure upon getting the license. And that's a letter on the client's letterhead addressed to the NJCRC, as well as signed by myself so that they know, hey, this is real from a licensed broker as well as a reputable firm that actually places policies in this industry. And one thing I would say that's very important as well, as you're looking for brokers to represent you or, insurance professionals, agents to represent you in the cannabis insurance space, make sure that they have cannabis experience, right? So cannabis insurance is not a generalist game. So it's not somebody who just does like every type of insurance and hey, I get what comes to me. It's a specialty game, right? Like it's something that you should go with somebody who concentrates in that space or has at least written and has a number of different clients along this different spectrum of the supply chain so that you're not anybody's guinea pig or you're not something that somebody's trying out for the first time. And there are enough professionals in the space now that have that experience to connect with.
Nice. And does that sort of translate the same way for the annual application?
Yeah, it does. It translates very similar. So the only thing truly that the CRC's requirements for insurance should be thought about as yes, you want to check the box on that because you have to for the application, right? And in order to get past that. But really what they require is just $1 million in coverage if you are a secure transport or a dispensary that has a delivery. And they want to be able to show you have to be able to show that you have the ability to receive that coverage. Now, what I want a lot of people to think about also is like, hey, it's great to get through the application process, but we're all putting in applications so we can actually open a business and be
Yeah.
successful. So like think about the NJCRCs as like bare bones minimum what you have to do. What really how you should be thinking about this is and these are conversations, these are really business conversations with your partners as well as with yourself to understand what your true appetite for risk is, right? Like if something does happen, am I comfortable being out this amount of money before I'm back, right? Like ask yourself specific questions to understand and make sure that you are adequately insured across your entire business, not just auto, not just workers' comp, but every facet of your business is insured adequately. Not overinsured, not underinsured. I say adequately because the point of insurance is to put you back in the same spot that you were prior to loss. Not in a worse spot, not necessarily in a better spot, but definitely in the same spot so that you're able to still move forward and be successful as a business.
Yeah, and that's very interesting that you say like insurance for cannabis and being specific that whoever you're working with has cannabis knowledge is important versus like just the blanket insurance that we're seeing for any other thing. Is that because of the risk with cannabis? Why do you think specifically dealing with cannabis focused insurance brokers or agencies is important?
Well, it's really important because one, I would say in any business that you're in, you should lean towards a professional that has experience in your vertical. Like it doesn't matter like if we were talking real estate, you should go after somebody who has experience in real estate, right? You should have an attorney that has experience in real estate. So same thing with cannabis. I believe that that's just across all your partners. That's your CPA, that's your attorney, every person that makes up your business and your trusted advisors should have experience specific to cannabis because there are differences. There are nuances that takes experience to make sure that you don't make mistakes doing, right? So like main thing on cannabis insurance side, there are not that many carriers in the cannabis insurance space,
Hmm.
right? So knowing which carriers to go to for which risk, having relationships with those carriers are big, being able to get things back in a timely manner, having a good amount of premium written with those carriers, those are all things that helps in those conversations. And specifically, I'm just a big believer on, you you go with people that are have experience in what you're trying to accomplish. And that's in anything you do. If I would never tell you to go out and, get an attorney that didn't have experience in the cannabis industry, just because there are extreme differences.
Yeah, no, you brought something up for me when I think about cannabis. We do have limitations, unlike any other businesses, because of the product, because of federal illegality. Do you think if there's a chance, if federal legalization does happen, does that open up the carrier world for insurance, or would folks still be pretty nervous to work with cannabis businesses?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that could open up. I think when you think about insurance, it's very much insurance is at a state level, right? So every state has their banking and insurance department. Banking and insurance are always, for some reason, it's always banking and insurance. So I think those two kind of go in line with one another. So as
Mm,
we kind of see, whether it's reschedule, deschedule, or legalization, all of those things I think would have a positive impact on just the insurance market as a whole. I think more access to capital, banking. There are premium financing companies that have a big part of insurance. So as more of those things open up, I think more insurers would get more comfortable, specifically those admitted insurers, to be able to get into the cannabis space.
okay, great. One thing you brought up was workers. So the New Jersey cannabis industry now employs tens of thousands of people within the state, especially as new businesses come online. Can you talk to us a little bit about workers' compensation? Just in general, let's start with like, what is it? How does it help? And does the CRC give us any requirements that we must have when it comes to workers' compensation? Are there minimums or premiums that has to happen? Or is that up for the business to kind of determine what they need in that workers' compensation package based on their business size and type?
Yeah, so it is so workers' compensation is a mandatory insurance coverage in the state of New Jersey. It's not mandatory in every state, but it is mandatory in the state of New Jersey.
Mm,
And if you are an employer that goes without workers' compensation, there is a penalty that goes along with that. So first 10 days without having that, there's a $5,000 penalty, and then there's a $5,000 penalty for every segment of 10 days you then go through past without having workers' compensation insurance. So fortunately, yeah, it's expensive. It's not a choice in the state of New Jersey, right? And historically, New Jersey, outside of California, is the most employee litigious state. I mean, by that, I mean is the most employee friendly state.
yeah.
They want you to provide a safe working environment for your employees, right? Workers' compensation is vital to every business, but it is extremely important, because it covers your employee if they were to get injured on the job, right? It pays for medical expenses, it pays for lost wages and work-related injuries. And frankly, it's not really a choice. It's not a nice to have. You have to
Yeah.
have it as an employer. And frankly, as an employer, you want it, right? Because you don't want that level of liability of something happening to your employees while they're on the clock, and you now being responsible for any losses that come from that, right?
Yeah.
Now, as far as
That
it is up to organizations how they do their workers' compensation. Workers' compensation is one of those coverages that, yeah, you can pick a limit on the workers' compensation, but it's very much driven by the type of employees you have, right? By employee work code, as well as your actual payroll. So, you know, not one of those glitz and glamour coverages, but as an employer, it's something you have to make sure that you are providing coverage to your employees while they're working in the commission of your business.
I know with insurance too, there's a bunch of different types of coverages one can have for their business. There are the ones that are mandatory by the state for businesses. What are some that people don't often think to have, but you say like, hey, maybe you should think about this in terms of coverage?
So I would say one that comes up pretty often that people don't think about is employee practice liability insurance, and that kind of goes hand in hand. Kind of goes hand in hand with workers' comp. Totally separate coverage, but it is a coverage for your employees. And again, with New Jersey being the second most employee friendly state, there tends to be a lot of claims from ex-employees, whether that's a disgruntled employee, whether that's an employee that felt like they were fired for an unjust reason, whether that's an employee that feels like they dealt with harassment, any of those things, and an employee came back and tried to sue an employer. Employee practice liability is the coverage that would help you there. And that's something that when I'm dealing with my clients, they don't think about all the time. And it's something that I always make sure to include that they look at because it's important. Employment one, employees are the most important thing in anyone's business, right? Is the viability of all of everyone's business. But it's a very finicky thing. It's a very touchy thing, right? Where as an employer, you have to hold your employees to standards. And if those standards are not being met, unfortunately, there are actions that have to be taken, right? And there are steps that have to be taken. And sometimes that leads to the firing of an employee. And a lot of times when employees are let go, sometimes I wouldn't say a lot of times they feel like they were let go for an unjust reason, right? I think we all think
Yeah, we're right.
we all think that we're God's gift, right? But in reality, there are things that, if you don't do as an employee, you can't continue to be employed. But that fine line, that's why you have something like employee practice liability coverage to make sure that you're covered in case, there is a discrepancy.
Yeah, makes sense. You also touched on property a little bit, and I know that one is huge. Is that mandatory by the state as well?
So not by the state, but property coverage is mandatory off if you have a lease, it's
Yeah.
mostly going to be mandatory. Now, just don't get me wrong, it depends on what type of lease. So if you have a triple net lease, right, which means you are responsible for normally in most triple net leases that I've seen, you are responsible for covering the actual physical building itself, right?
Yeah.
All of it, not just your tenant betterment and improvements on the inside, but the entire building. Now, if you're leasing the building, sometimes landlords want you to cover the property as well. Now, if most of the time your big portion of property coverage, a large portion of my clients that are not, that don't have triple net leases, right? They cover their tenant betterments and improvements. They cover their business personal property. They cover their sign, right? Because a lot of people do put money into their sign, specifically retail, more on the retail side. And they're covering, I think most importantly, covering their cannabis, their product, their finished products.
Mhm.
And those are all components of property coverage.
Right.
Um, now, depending on where you are, there are different things that come into play with property coverage, like, name storms. And that just means like, hey, if a storm has a name, right? Like Sandy, right? If a storm like that came through, there are some property policies that have exclusion on named storms, right? So if you had a loss by way of a named storm, that could be excluded, right? So it's important that you know certain nuances like that. I mean, us here in New Jersey, not being as coastal, depending on what part of New Jersey you're in, don't have to deal with some of those risks as much. Just like on the property side, there's sometimes exclusion for risk for wind and hail, depending on where you're at in the country. Mostly see that with like clients in Oklahoma and in that part of the country,
Right.
but those are all nuances that could be part of a property policy.
Right. And I know in that property policy, so you talked about like equipment, cultivations, manufacturers, they use a lot of, industry equipment to build out products, so on and so forth. When people, and forgive me if I'm not using the right terminology here in insurance, when people purchase property insurance, and let's say they do have a triple net lease that covers everything, you're also saying that equipment inside or being used will also be covered.
So that specifically, so for cultivators and manufacturers, that equipment is getting listed on their property breakdown, right?
Okay.
As a separate line item. So everything on property policies with cannabis industry is essentially broken down, right? It's broken down between physical property, business personal property, your actual again signs and personal advertising injury, as well as it has a section for your equipment. If you're a retailer, obviously not as much, but your equipment and essentially your grow equipment and HVAC equipment can be listed out as a separate line item on your property policy. There's also the ability to get equipment breakdown coverage, which is another level of coverage. So if there was a breakdown on on the equipment that you're looking to cover, that would allow you another level of coverage on that property policy.
Nice. Have you ever seen a case? Because I want to bring it back to how like the CRC gets involved because you do go through that investigation period when after awarding a license, you have an investigator come in, help cross your T's, dot your I's. Have you had any instances when when an investigator really kind of like taps into someone's insurance coverage to say, hey, you know what, you don't have this, this, and that. I think you need to get it, maybe because of like something they're noticing. Just any cases you've seen working with clients in the New Jersey cannabis industry that can help students sort of prepare in case their investigator has questions about their insurance policy. And if that happens, does that require a business to change, their plans, or is it more so a recommendation?
Yeah, so I would say so with investigators, so also like there's a ton of different investigators in New Jersey, and everyone is a little bit different how their process is. So I've seen some investigators that want to see so final inspection, right? When you are getting ready to get your final inspection and actually get your license to operate. Some investigators when they're coming want to see the policy active in their hand that day, right? And that means from a standpoint of everything. They want to see that the product is going to be covered. If there's vehicles involved, they want to make sure there's a minimum of $1 million in coverage from that perspective. Every inspector that I've dealt with, I have a number of clients in New Jersey. Every inspector I've helped them deal with has wanted to see their insurance coverage at some point, whether it's right then and there when they are there for the final inspection, or as part of the final checklist that they have to send in order to get their license to operate after that final inspection is complete, pending that checklist once received by the inspectors is passed through. So I wouldn't say inspectors are going as deep as seeing things in a facility and saying, hey, you need to insure this. They are making sure that insurance coverage is there from a perspective of delivery insurance, from a perspective of making sure that you do have coverage for the product that's going to be on site. So I have had specific instances where investigators would not allow retailers to receive product until they had their product coverage in place. Not product liability, but coverage for their product in place.
Nice.
Property coverage for their product in place.
Nice.
So
Yeah.
that I've seen pretty readily. But from a standpoint of specific things being pointed out by inspectors, but it's common across the board that all inspectors want to see the insurance. It's just, is it during the final inspection or is it right after in that checklist? And I've been through that scramble with clients many a time.
Mm. Well, thanks for that breakdown. I'm going to wrap up soon because we have dived into a ton about insurance. And of course, all this information is in your courses. I only have a couple more questions. And again, if any students are having some questions during our chat, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box or directly in the chat, and we will get to those. I think one type of insurance I hear about every now and again, but I don't know where it applies to some folks in the supply chain of cannabis is cyber liability insurance. With the growing reliance on like a digital standpoint, whether it's like a point of sale system, how does cyber liability, like people's websites or, apps and things of that nature to really engage with your cannabis customers? How can cyber liability insurance protect cannabis businesses from like data breaches and cyber attacks, which we're seeing happen in like different industries? And I know that may not be super mandatory, but are you seeing it as coverage you're recommending or people are getting? And how prevalent are cyber issues in the cannabis industry?
Yeah, so I absolutely recommend cyber to all of my clients. I mean, we're if you think about it from a standpoint, we're in an industry, and just to take a step back, cyber coverage, cyber insurance is not necessarily like protecting you against data breaches and things. They're helping you with the reaction after a data breach and things of that nature, so that you have coverage. So that you have funds to be able to, go out and, a lot of times we're seeing ransomware. If it's pay a ransom to be able to get that information back and released. If it's pay for the actual cleanup and now you have to notify all of your customers and those whose sensitive information was breached from your system. Um, you know, Being proactive on the front end is also very important, and making sure that you have the encryption, the bit encryption necessary, whether you're a retailer and people are signing into your site to look at your menu. Now, because everybody uses metric, it doesn't matter in any of the spot of the cannabis supply chain you're in, everybody has to use metric. Metric has been hacked before in California and some of the West Coast states, right? So cyber is specifically very important to any operators that technically are medical cannabis operators, because then there's medical information, and that's now a HIPAA violation, which comes with another whole different line of fines and just extreme I would say people's information now being out. It's very important. I mean, from your kiosk to your system, data breaches are at an all-time high.
Yeah.
It's important to make sure, more so than anything, that you're protecting your consumers' information, right? Because that's really the information that would be out there, when and if someone in the cannabis industry's information was hacked.
Nice. Thanks for that breakdown too, because I have been seeing a lot of conversations just around like the tech space and cannabis, and I was interested to know where insurance sort of crossed over. My last question for you, or for those that are like in the ancillary space, so like not necessarily a brand, but let's say service providers, that are offering services to consult with different businesses. Do they need a level of protection? Is that something they should look into? For I don't know, I'm looking at something here, errors and omissions insurance. Um, is that something folks can look into? Because we do here at CTA also want to encourage folks to explore ancillary businesses that support the cannabis industry overall. So maybe you're a graphic designer for cannabis businesses, or you do something to provide a service. What sort of insurance should you be looking for anyway?
So when you think about E&O, errors and omissions, you want to think about businesses that are, the biggest, consulting businesses, law firms, CPAs, insurance professionals, right? Because essentially we're looked at as trusted advisors, and we're giving advice,
Mhm.
right? So we're giving advice to people on what they should do. Consultants giving advice in order to get said license, right? Attorneys, same thing. So it's important because you have to be protected from allegations of negligence or failure to provide the professional service that you were brought on, right?
Mm.
So that is huge, because we do see pretty often that consultants and more consultants than attorneys often end up on the wrong side of lawsuits, whether that's from unhappy applicants. There's a number of people. But anytime that you're giving someone advice that could be deemed advice that they relied upon in order to make a decision, you should have that type of errors and omission insurance to make sure that you're covered from any of those clients trying to come back to say they received incorrect advice, and those things cause them a loss of revenue, which is what has led to the suit. So that's very important for those lines of businesses.
Right. I feel like we covered a lot today when it comes to insurance and the different types of insurance. Is there anything outstanding you think needed to be mentioned on this call when it comes to insurance for cannabis businesses here in New Jersey?
No, I think, just overall in general, cannabis is all, I'm sorry, insurance is also, specifically in the cannabis industry, is often kind of an afterthought, right? It's kind of, I get a lot of calls,
And
8th hour,
panic.
like, hey, can you put this in place today? Hey,
Right.
my stuff renews tomorrow. I get a lot of those calls. I would say be proactive in the way that you're looking at your risk, right? And when I say be proactive, that's even before you get to the insurance part, with how you're training your employees, the decisions, some of the just the overall decisions that you're making, just making good decisions as a business owner. And just going at everything with a plan, I think is very important, right? Even when it comes down to filling out these insurance applications, like it's important that you know what your projected revenue is. You want to make sure that that is pretty on par with either what you're going to do or at least what you've been raising for, because you want all of those things to coincide, right? Like revenue is projected revenue is a big portion of how you're rated, right? Based on kind of your risk profile, as a startup cannabis business, right? And if you put your projections way too high, you're going to be paying way too much for insurance, and insurance companies are not giving you checks back saying, "Hey, you overpaid." Right.
Yeah.
Now, if you do more in revenue, they're definitely coming for you looking for more premium. And that's just kind of how the industry works. So I would say, the same way that you vet, your trusted advisors that you're choosing to work with, the same way you build your team, make sure that you have somebody that understands the ins and outs of risk and insurance. Have a go-to person. Have somebody that has experience, specifically in the cannabis industry, placing policies and has active clients, and is able to kind of help and guide you. There are steps in this process, right? Where, at first in the application process, you just have to show the ability to be able to get it, right? And then once you get are approved for application and get said license and start the build out process, you then have to look at ensuring your assets, which essentially are your property, which will be your products, which will be your employees, right? Which is one of the most important assets you have as a company. And that's really how insurance should be looked at, is protection of your overall assets and the viability, and the protection to make sure that you're a viable and successful business.
Nice. I love the way you broke that down, because it does, like I said, I started this call off saying I think people think of this as an afterthought when really it's something you can get squared away pretty early on. I'm also pretty guilty of it myself, you know that.
And,
But
and should be something you plug into your projections too, right? Like
yeah,
this should be a line item on your P&L, right? Insurance coverages, because it needs to be part of your
it's part
your
of, you have to
overall
coexist
thought
as a business.
as a business owner. And I make myself available, anybody and everybody that has questions, I'm happy to be a resource. I love the portion of insurance of really teaching, right? Because I want my clients to know what they're buying, why they're buying it, and how it helps them if something does happen to them.
It's a question I ask every instructor when we wrap up. Is just what is the advantage of taking your course here at the NJCTA in prepping our students to be successful entrepreneurs in the New Jersey cannabis industry?
Yeah, I think the advantage of taking my course is, it is like cheating on the test, right? I have successfully been a part of or helped a number of people with successful applications that have gone through and helped with their specific plan to obtain liability insurance. Myself, as a successful applicant, have also completed that portion. So in taking my course, you'll understand exactly what needs to go into that portion of the application. So that that's one thing out of your mind, that you're not going to receive a notice back from the CRC saying, "Hey, you need to adjust this." Also, it's a very, what I would say, broken down version of just how to understand insurance in general as it relates to cannabis, right? And as it relates to your cannabis business, whether it's retail, whether in the manufacturing space, cultivation, or you're a brand, or you're an ancillary business. It breaks down insurance, the nuances of insurance, things you should be looking at as a business owner, the different ways to look at your risk profile, and ultimately just make the best informed decisions as it relates to insurance, and your cannabis business.
Well, thank you so much, James, for your time. Thank you to our students and everyone that participated. This webinar will be up on our portal for you shortly so that you guys can go back, review, and get back all this vital information about insurance and cannabis. James, I thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for joining us. This will conclude our webinars for 2024, but we have a jam-packed schedule for you come 2025, especially as many of you get through levels 6, 7, 8, and we are going to start dropping levels 9. I know a lot of you have been excited for that. That's when we're getting into the nitty-gritty about SOPs. I'm looking forward to it. I thank you all for joining us, and everyone, please have a great night.